Mr. Mike Collier. Welcome to the Clean Daily Herald, and thank you for joining us. You've had an exciting week thus far. Your team announced on Monday that you are launching an exploratory committee to seek the office of Texas Lieutenant Governor in 2022. You did lose the 2018 race against incumbent Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick by less than 5 percentage points. What lessons did you learn from that race, and why do you think you'll be successful this time around?
Well, it's a big state, and we came close, and if we'd had more time, I think we would have won. You know the old expression that a football team never lost a game, they just ran out of time. So the way I look at it is we finished the second half down by a field goal. Now we're coming back for the second half and planning to win. And I have traveled all over the state launching this campaign in rural Texas. And I've been talking to Texans now for the better part of a decade. And what Texans are looking for in a lieutenant governor is just somebody who will solve problems and work honestly to do that. And Dan Patrick doesn't. And he's a sensationalist, and it's spin, and it's really quite zany sometimes. Sometimes makes you very angry, but doesn't focus on the issues. And so we see what happens. Lately, we've really seen what happens with the grid, with COVID, if you have leaders that really don't focus on leading. And that's why I think there's a very good chance that I'll win this time.
Can you explain the role of the Texas Lieutenant Governor for those who don't know, and how the office affects Texans, and what specific skills you feel you possess to take on that role?
Well, it's a great question. The Texas Lieutenant Governor, some would say, is the most powerful political position in the state because he or she presides over the Senate, and so has an outsized influence on legislation as it's being drafted, as contrasted to the governor who has to wait for this work to be done. So it's very important. It goes back to the 1870s. For those that understand Texas history a lot better than me, there was a governor that people didn't like at all, and so the Constitution was rewritten so that a lieutenant governor could have outsized influence. And when you think about what the legislature can do for people in their lives in Texas, it's very, very important. And where do you begin? Public education is something that I'm very passionate about. I think we need to have the best public schools in the nation. I'm very supportive of teachers, retired teachers. My grandmother was a teacher. I've always been passionate about public education. That's our future, and the state dominates all of the decisions about financing public education, so that's a big part of it. Healthcare is a big part of it. Healthcare is something on everybody's mind. It's unbelievably expensive. We have to work on this. We should expand Medicaid, for example. The legislature could do that, should do that. There's the power grid. I mean, let's talk about the power grid. It should not have gone down. That was terrible. I mean, we had people die over that. And then property taxes. Property taxes, for some, just keep going up and up and up. And the legislature does not deal, in my opinion, does not deal honestly and fairly when it comes to homeowner property taxes.
And then what sets you apart from your opponent? What are your biggest differences?
Well, so my opponent is not a businessman. My opponent is a radio personality, and I'll stop there. In contrast, I come out of the business world. I mean, I'm a CPA, and I was a partner for a long time at an accounting firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers. My clients were the biggest clients. For a living, I solve large, complex problems for my clients. I view the state of Texas as my client. And so what I do is solve problems. I don't race for headlines, spin nonsense. I don't do that. And I have a pretty clear idea, I think, as to how to solve some of these problems. I also know that I need to hear from others. One of the things I've learned from campaigning is you can march into a part of the state that you may not be all that familiar with, and you think you know the issues until you start asking questions. You think you know the solutions until you start asking questions. And so a big part of being lieutenant governor, in my opinion, is being out, talking to folks, making sure that the Texas government is serving our needs. I don't see my opponent doing that. He takes a lot of votes, particularly in Republican territory. He takes a lot of votes and voters for granted.
If elected, what would be your top 3 priorities, and how will you ensure those 3 priorities come to fruition?
Always public education, for me, is priority 1. If we don't get public education right, we're not going to get anything right. We have a moral obligation to all of our young people so that they grow up and they have critical thinking skills, they're good citizens, employed and happy and productive. Public education. And it has to be public education. Most of our students are in public schools. And along those lines is, supporting teachers, retired teachers. We don't pay our teachers enough. We don't treat them well enough. Testing is a disaster. We must get rid of high-stakes testing. There's a much better way, and we need to find that better way. I put all that under priority number one, public education. Another priority is healthcare. So healthcare is becoming so expensive that people just can't simply afford it. They've got the best job they can get. They'd find another job that made more money if they could. They're doing the best they can, and they still cannot afford healthcare. It's not their fault. So we have to deal with that. There's an opportunity to do that quite simply, which is to expand Medicaid. And most other states have done it, even Republican states. In fact, there's support. Democrats have always supported expanding Medicaid. The business community has always supported expanding Medicaid. Texans have always supported expanding Medicaid, in my opinion. The Republican Senate is not. Now, the good news is that there are now Republican senators who are warming up to the idea. That's very good news. But my opponent, Dan Patrick, is not. So we have to expand Medicaid. And there are other steps that can be done to improve transparency so that prices come down, so that you know how much things cost. One thing I despise is surprise medical bills. I've been hit by a surprise medical bill, and I'm still angry. And not to say that I'm the kind of person to settle a score, but I know how people feel. They worry. If they go to the hospital or go to the doctor's office, they're going to get hit with a bill they can't pay. That's just not right. So criminal justice is very important to me. We have an awful lot of people that are sitting in prison that shouldn't be sitting in prison, and that's just not right. You take a lot of young men, a lot of black men end up in prison, and they don't need to be in prison, and their lives are pretty much ruined. And that is not right. Black lives matter. And I say that because I believe it, and we need to work on that. I put that all under the heading of justice. You told me I had to limit it to 3. Can I throw in a couple more?
Throw in a couple more if you want to.
Well, I think we've got some real problems that we have to fix, like the grid. We can talk about that if you'd like.
Going to come down in the next.
Going to come back to that? Okay. So we'll come back to the grid. There are other issues: water infrastructure, property taxes, as we discussed. You can't really talk about public education without talking about property taxes. And the burden on homeowners, the property tax burden on homeowners and small businesses, has gone up dramatically on Dan Patrick's watch, despite the fact that he's been talking about it for a decade. He doesn't do anything about it. We can come back to that if you'd like to. So that's just, I could go on, but those are the kinds of things that I have in mind that the Lieutenant Governor ought to be working on.
Some 200 Texans died during February's surprise winter storm. What would you have done differently had you been in office as Lieutenant Governor during that crisis?
Well, first of all, we were all astonished that it happened. It should never have happened. And I'll have 2 things to say about that. First of all, the legislature was warned that the grid could not tolerate a cold snap. Many of us didn't know this, but it was ERCOT who came to them in 2017, and they studied what happened in 2016, which was a cold year, and they studied the generators, and they came back and they said this would happen. They predicted it. They even went so far as to say that failing to prepare is preparing to fail. But the legislature did not do what they should have done, which is to require the generators to winterize. Generators didn't want to because they didn't want to spend the money. But that's just unacceptable. That's unacceptable. So the first thing we have to do is fix the grid. We have to make sure that it works. Second, Wall Street Journal has shown us a very interesting study that says that we are paying more for electricity in a deregulated environment than if we were a utility. Now think about that for a second. We get a rickety grid that we're paying more for. Somebody is out there making a bunch of money on this deregulated grid, and it's not helping us. So that needs to be looked at, and that needs to be fixed. And frankly, I don't trust my opponent because I know where his campaign money comes from. We'll have head fakes and we'll have spin, but I don't think it'll be real. We'll be watching that very, very carefully. Then in terms of when you actually have the crisis, and a lieutenant governor will be confronted with crises that they can't predict. This one was predictable. One of the most important things you do is communicate with local leaders. You know, we depend on our local leadership. I'm very big into local control. There's a reason why we elect our county officials, our city officials, because we know them, they know us, They make good decisions. We hold them accountable if they make bad decisions. That's how Texas politics ought to work. And when you have a crisis, the state and local need to work together. Lieutenant governors should be on the phone. Are we still being recorded?
Yeah. Just keep going.
It's ironic that we're talking about the grid and the lights go off.
They're back on.
No, they should. They should be working together. The same with COVID. I mean, they should be working together, not against each other. I favor local control, but I think the state has more resources than local. They need to work together on these things. Our guys didn't.
Yeah, absolutely. How could the office of the Lieutenant Governor help Texans during the pandemic? And what could the Lieutenant Governor's office do to get Texas's pandemic economy rolling again?
Well, the pandemic has been deadly for some, shattering if you lost a loved one, frustrating for the rest of us. It hurt our economy. A lot of businesses really, really suffered. A lot of family-owned businesses really, really suffered. And so I was very critical of our top leadership almost from the beginning. I thought the response was terrible. I thought it caused the pandemic to be much more impactful in a negative way. A lot of people died as a consequence. Here's where I think they went wrong. And I know this from business because, senior executives of businesses are routinely confronted with challenges, not anything as severe as a pandemic, but they're confronted with challenges, and they have large organizations. And the most important thing is to communicate and to motivate and to measure. And when we came off of that very, very expensive lockdown, which was devastating, the question is, were we measuring? Were we testing people, making sure that we knew where the disease was? Were our leaders communicating the importance of wearing a mask and keeping your distance? I've always believed that if Texans understood that wearing a mask really is to help others, not to some extent it helps yourself, but the main event is you might be a carrier, you don't know it, you go to the hardware store, and then you get a person sick. If Texans understood that you're helping others in the community, not yourself, it would have been a very, very different situation. Instead, our leaders politicized it and turned wearing a mask into a political statement. I was just absolutely astonished that they would do that. And then motivate. I don't like government telling me what to do. Nobody wants government telling them what to do, particularly in Texas. But Texans will do the right thing, but you have to give them good information, you have to motivate them. So I give our leaders very, very low marks. And it's not over. I'm very concerned because that virus continues to race through our community. They seem to be completely ignoring the fact that while that virus is alive, it could morph and could turn into something that is vaccine resistant and would start over. Why on earth would we take that risk except for political reasons, which is, Texans are very unhappy about that. I'm very unhappy about that.
And then where do you stand on the issue of expanding the state reimbursement for counties and municipalities such as Harker Heights, Nolanville, and Lampasas County, who are disproportionately affected by the 100% disabled veterans property tax exemption?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you brought up that issue. It's a very, very important issue to the people in this part of the state. It ought to be an important issue to every American who's a patriot because of the debt that we owe our veterans and the veterans that are 100% disabled. We cannot do enough to help them, period. So the fact that they get a break on their property taxes is fabulous. The fact that the city then doesn't have that money is not fabulous. And what do cities do in response? They have to crank up the property taxes on everybody else, people who are paying able to pay property taxes. That isn't fair to them. Or underfund police. We have to fund police, fire, schools, the rest. To me, it is a no-brainer. The state should keep local governments whole because it's in the state's best interest to treat our veterans, disabled veterans, with the respect that they deserve. And we're a wealthy state. We can afford it. And this business about, well, some cities count because they touch the base, Harker Heights is across the street, no, you don't get that support. That's just nonsense. I would support fully funding these local governments. We're a wealthy state. We can afford it. It's the right thing to do.
And is there anything else you want voters to know about, you or what your plans are for the campaign or anything like that?
Well, it's a long campaign. I call this first phase exploratory. Um, I don't want anybody to be confused. I'm committed to doing this. I mean, I'm very passionate about this. I'm quite prepared to unwind my business. That is not an inconsequential step, but it's what I need to do. But I want to confirm that folks will support me, that there's people think that I'm the right person for the job. Of course, they'll tell me in November next year, but I want my party and my friends around the state to tell me that. So we're running around the state confirming this. So far, so good.
Okay.
I feel very, very good about the support. The only thing I would mention is, I'm a kid from Georgetown, Texas. Georgetown now is a big city. I'll bet we've got 100,000 people in it. But when we moved there, and for folks who don't know, it's only about 25 miles south of here. I'm going to go see mom and dad. You buy some barbecue. I've been doing this for years. When we moved there in 1975, it was about 8,500 people. It was pure farming and ranching. The Williamson County cattle auction there, the Sheriff's Posse Rodeo. So I come from, as far as I'm concerned, I come from rural Texas, even though it's now owned and operated it's part of the Austin Metroplex. But I love the state, and I love the people in it. And I think a lieutenant governor candidate should be out talking to people, listening carefully, and then once elected, get back out on the road and talk to people and make sure that our Texas government is responding to their needs in a way that's fiscally responsible. And if you frame it that way, Lauren, it doesn't sound like rocket science. But the fellow that I'm running against, Dan Patrick, has had a decade as a senator and now as lieutenant governor. And he doesn't share that point of view. I'll let him explain himself, but that's not what you get. He's not one of us. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, but he's just not one of us.
Well, thank you so much for being here today, Mr. Collier. I really appreciate you taking the time to visit us at the Killeen Daily Herald, and we will see you on the campaign trail.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.